What was your "that's not what I expected" story? When I was 22, I worked at a coffee shop with this girl Mia. Sweet, but she'd constantly complain about her roommate stealing her food, moving her stuff, leaving messes everywhere. Mia would come in furious. She ate my leftover pizza again, or she used all my shampoo. I'd listen and sympathize because roommate drama sucks. At first it seemed normal, but Mia's stories got more specific over time. She described finding her cereal box half empty, or her toothbrush moved from the left side of the sink to the right. Sarah must have used it, she'd say. So gross. I started paying attention because Mia seemed genuinely stressed. Dark circles under her eyes, losing weight, constantly checking her phone for text from this Sarah person. She'd show me screenshots of their arguments, long walls of text where Mia would accuse Sarah of moving things, and Sarah would just respond with question marks, or "what are you talking about? She's gaslighting me," Mia would explain, acting innocent when she knows exactly what she did. She had this whole theory that Sarah was deliberately messing with her head. The breaking point came when Mia accused Sarah of wearing her clothes. She showed me a selfie Sarah had posted on Instagram wearing a blue sweater. "That's my sweater," Mia said, zooming in on the photo. "I bought it 3 months ago. She's literally stealing my identity." I looked at the sweater. It was just a basic blue cardigan from Target. Could have been anyone's, but Mia was convinced. She started talking about hidden cameras, about Sarah going through her diary, about feeling unsafe in her own home. "I think she's trying to drive me crazy," Mia whispered one day during our break, "like she wants me to move out so she can have the place to herself." I suggested she find a new roommate or move out entirely. Mia's face fell. "I can't afford to break the lease, and Sarah knows that. She's doing this on purpose." The complaints escalated. Sarah was supposedly using Mia's Netflix account, stealing her mail, even moving furniture around while Mia was at work. "I came home yesterday and my couch was facing the wrong direction," she told me. Dead serious. "Who does that?" Our manager started getting concerned. Mia would show up to work distracted, constantly texting, sometimes taking phone calls in the back where she'd argue with someone in hushed tones. "Sarah's denying everything again," she'd explain when she came back to the counter. I began to notice inconsistencies. Mia claimed Sarah worked nights, but then would complain about Sarah being loud during the day. She said Sarah was messy, but also accused her of obsessively cleaning Mia's stuff. The final straw was when Mia started missing shifts. She'd call in saying Sarah had hidden her work uniform, or that Sarah had deliberately broken her alarm clock. "She's sabotaging my job now," Mia sobbed over the phone. "She wants me to get fired so I can't pay rent." This went on for months. Mia even showed me photos of the evidence. Empty containers, dishes in weird places, her clothes supposedly moved around. One day, Mia calls out sick, then another day. By the third day, our manager is worried and asks me to do a wellness check since I live nearby. I knock on her door. No answer. The landlord lets me in. The apartment is completely empty. Not just of people, of furniture, belongings, everything. Like no one had lived there in years. I call our manager, confused. She contacts Mia's emergency contact, her sister. That's when everything unraveled. Mia had been living in her car for 8 months. The apartment address she gave work was an abandoned unit she'd sneak into. There was no roommate. Never had been. She was forgetting she'd eaten things due to malnutrition and stress. She'd been so ashamed about being homeless that she created an entire fictional living situation, complete with a problematic roommate to explain away all the inconsistencies in her life. I stood in that empty apartment for what felt like forever, trying to process what I'd just learned. The landlord, an older guy with paint-stained fingers, looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and annoyance. "She's been breaking in here for months," he said, jangling his keys. Security cameras caught her a few times, but she always ran when we showed up. "We thought she was just some squatter." I asked him when the unit had last been occupied. "About a year ago," he replied. "Been trying to renovate it, but with the budget cuts we keep putting it off." She wasn't doing any damage, so we kind of just let it slide. Figured she'd move on eventually. My hands were shaking as I called our manager, Rachel. She picked up on the second ring. "Did you find Mia? Is she okay?" "Rachel, we need to talk in person. This is bigger than we thought." I drove back to the coffee shop in a daze. Every conversation I'd had with Mia over the past 8 months played through my head like a broken movie reel. The detailed complaints about Sarah, the screenshots of text conversations, the photos of moved items. Had she been staging all of that, creating fake text threads, taking pictures of random objects and claiming they'd been disturbed? Rachel was waiting for me in the back office, stress lines etched deep around her eyes. She'd been managing Roasted Bean Cafe for 6 years and prided herself on taking care of her employees. This situation was eating at her. "Okay, what did you find?" she asked, closing the door behind me. I told her everything. The empty apartment, the landlord's revelation, what Mia's sister had shared about her living situation. Rachel's face went pale. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, sinking into her desk chair. "How did we miss this? How did I miss this?" "She was good at hiding it," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if that was entirely true. Looking back, there had been signs. Mia never talked about going home for holidays. She'd sometimes smell like she hadn't showered in days, which she'd blame on Sarah using all the hot water. She'd eat every free meal or leftover pastry we had at work with the intensity of someone who wasn't sure when their next meal would come. Rachel was already pulling up Mia's employee file on her computer. She listed that apartment address when we hired her 10 months ago, but if she's been homeless for 8 months, she must have been living there legitimately when she started. I said, "Something happened. Lost her lease, couldn't make rent, got evicted," but she was too ashamed to tell anyone, so she just kept pretending. We sat in silence for a moment, both trying to wrap our heads around the elaborate deception. Rachel finally spoke up. "I need to call her sister back, get the full story, figure out how we can help." The sister, whose name was Lisa, agreed to meet us the next morning. She looked like an older, more weathered version of Mia, with the same delicate features but harder eyes. She clutched a coffee cup with both hands as she sat across from Rachel and me in the empty cafe before opening hours. "Mia's always been fragile," Lisa began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even as kids, she had trouble dealing with stress. When things got overwhelming, she'd just create these alternate realities where everything made sense." She told us about Mia's childhood, their parents' messy divorce when Mia was 12, how Mia had struggled in school, not because she wasn't smart, but because she couldn't handle the social pressures. She'd come home with these elaborate stories about friends who didn't exist, about teachers who were picking on her when really she just wasn't doing the work. "But this level of fabrication," Rachel said carefully, "this is different, right? This is more serious. Lisa nodded, wiping at her eyes. It got worse after high school. She'd get jobs, apartments, seemed like she was doing okay, then something would go wrong and she'd spiral. But instead of asking for help, she'd create these complex stories to explain why nothing was her fault. The previous year, Mia had been sharing an apartment with 2 other girls. According to Lisa, Mia had been struggling with depression and wasn't keeping up with her share of household responsibilities. Her roommates had tried to work with her, but when she stopped paying rent for 3 consecutive months, they'd had no choice but to ask her to leave. She was supposed to move back in with me temporarily, Lisa explained, but she was so ashamed, so convinced that she was a failure, that she just disappeared. Told me she'd found a new place with a friend. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. I thought about all those screenshots Mia had shown me. The angry text from Sarah demanding rent money, complaining about the mess, threatening to call the landlord. The text messages, I said, from her roommate. Were those fake? Lisa confirmed. She probably has multiple phone numbers, maybe some app that lets her create fake conversations. She's done it before, creates these detailed scenarios where she's the victim of someone else's cruelty, when really she's just struggling and doesn't know how to ask for help. Rachel was taking notes, her manager instincts kicking in. Where is she now? Is she safe? She's in my apartment, Lisa said. Has been for the past week since she finally broke down and called me. She's not in good shape, physically or mentally. I'm trying to get her into therapy, but she's resistant, keeps insisting that she was really being harassed by Sarah, that we're all against her. The 3 of us worked out a plan. Rachel would hold Mia's job open for another month while she got help. Lisa would make sure she had stable housing and access to mental health resources. I offered to visit to let her know that we cared about her and weren't judging her for what had happened. But when I showed up at Lisa's apartment 2 days later, Mia wouldn't see me. I could hear her voice through the bedroom door, angry and defensive. He's part of it now, she was saying. He went through my apartment. He's working with Sarah to make me look crazy. Lisa met me at the door with apologetic eyes. She's not ready, she said simply. The therapist says it might take time for her to accept reality. Right now, she's still convinced that Sarah is real, that this is all part of some elaborate conspiracy against her. I left my number and a note telling Mia that I hoped she'd reach out when she was ready, that we all missed her at work, but I had a sinking feeling that it might be a very long time before she was ready to face the truth about what had happened. Over the next few weeks, I found myself obsessing over the situation. I'd replay conversations with Mia, looking for signs I'd missed. How had she been so convincing? How had she managed to maintain such an elaborate fiction for so long? I started researching online, reading about homelessness, mental health, and the shame that often keeps people from seeking help. I learned that it's surprisingly common for people to go to great lengths to hide their housing instability. The stigma is so powerful that people will sleep in their cars, couch surf indefinitely, or even break into abandoned buildings rather than admit they need help. My coworker Jake, who'd been at the coffee shop longer than anyone, had his own theories. She probably started with small lies, he said during a slow afternoon shift. Maybe just didn't want to admit she was having roommate problems. But then the lies got bigger, and she had to keep adding details to make them believable. But the effort, I said, still struggling to understand. Creating fake text conversations, staging photos, maintaining this fiction every single day for months. That's not just shame, that's mental illness, Jake finished quietly. People don't fake being homeless for fun, man. She was clearly struggling with something bigger than just losing her apartment. Rachel had been in contact with Lisa regularly, and the updates weren't encouraging. Mia had agreed to see a therapist twice, but both sessions had ended with her walking out when the therapist suggested that her perceptions might not align with reality. She was still insisting that Sarah was real, that we were all being manipulated somehow. The therapist thinks it might be a form of dissociative disorder, Lisa told Rachel during one of their phone calls. When reality becomes too painful to accept, some people's minds create alternate explanations that feel safer, even if they're not true. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own guilt. How had I listened to Mia's stories for months without questioning them? Sure, roommate drama was normal, but looking back, some of her complaints had been bizarre. Who moves someone's couch to face the wrong direction? Who uses someone else's toothbrush and then carefully places it back in the wrong spot? I'd been so focused on being a good friend, on listening and sympathizing, that I'd never stopped to really think about whether her stories made sense. And maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe if I'd asked harder questions, pushed back gently on some of her more outlandish claims, she might have felt safe enough to tell me the truth. My girlfriend Emma, who I'd been dating for about 6 months at that point, listened patiently as I worked through my feelings about the situation. We were sitting in her apartment, takeout containers scattered across her coffee table, when I finally voiced what had been bothering me most. I keep thinking about how lonely she must have been, I said, living in her car, sneaking into that empty apartment just to have somewhere to exist during the day. And instead of reaching out for help, she created this whole elaborate story to explain why her life was falling apart. Emma tucked her legs under her on the couch, considering her words carefully. Maybe the story felt more manageable than the truth, she said. Like, I have a terrible roommate is a problem with a solution. You can move out, find a new place, cut contact with the toxic person, but I'm homeless and struggling with mental health issues feels overwhelming. Where do you even start with that? That perspective helped, but it also made me sadder. Mia had been so creative, so detailed in her fictional world. If she'd put that same energy into getting actual help, into reaching out to the people who cared about her, maybe things would have been different. About a month after the revelation, I was working an early morning shift when a familiar face appeared at the counter. It was Sarah, the real Sarah, the one from the Instagram photos Mia had shown me. She was shorter than I'd expected, with curly brown hair and paint-stained fingers. She ordered a simple black coffee and was turning to leave when something made me call out. "Excuse me," I said, my heart pounding. This is going to sound weird, but are you Sarah? Did you used to live with someone named Mia? Her face immediately shifted, confusion mixing with something that looked like recognition. "Oh my God," she said, stepping back to the counter. "Are you the guy from her work? The one she talked about all the time?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Sarah glanced around the mostly empty cafe, then leaned closer. "Is she okay?" she asked. "I've been worried about her for months. She used to text me these long, angry messages about how I was stealing her stuff and moving her things around. But I moved out of our shared apartment almost a year ago. I kept trying to tell her she had the wrong number, but she wouldn't listen." The pieces clicked into place. Sarah was was real, but she wasn't Mia's current roommate. She was an old roommate, probably from before Mia's life had started falling apart. But in Mia's mind, she'd become the perfect villain, the explanation for everything that was going wrong. She showed me screenshots of your conversations, I said carefully. You kept responding with question marks, like you didn't know what she was talking about. Because I didn't, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. I moved to Portland last year for art school. I've been living in a dorm room with a girl named Jessica, but Mia kept sending me these detailed accusations about eating her food and using her shampoo. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank or that she was having a breakdown. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through old text threads. She showed me the messages Mia had sent her. They were exactly as Mia had described to me, but from Sarah's perspective, they were completely insane. Random accusations about a living situation that didn't exist, angry demands for apologies about things that had never happened. I tried to call her a few times, Sarah continued, but she'd just scream at me about gaslighting her and hang up. Eventually, I had to block her number because it was affecting my mental health too, but I always wondered what had happened to her. She seemed like she was in a really dark place. I explained what we'd discovered about Mia's situation, watching Sarah's face cycle through shock, sadness, and understanding. That makes so much sense, she whispered. When we lived together, she was already struggling, behind on rent, having trouble keeping jobs, spending a lot of time alone in her room. I tried to be supportive, but I was dealing with my own stuff too. When I moved out, I felt guilty about leaving her with the full rent, but I couldn't afford to keep covering for her. Sarah's guilt was palpable, and I found myself in the strange position of comforting someone I'd never met about a situation none of us had fully understood at the time. You couldn't have known, I told her. And it sounds like you tried to help when you lived together. Not enough, she said, shaking her head. If I'd known she was going to end up homeless, I would have. I don't know, what would I have done? I was barely making ends meet myself. We exchanged numbers, both of us feeling like we needed to stay connected to this strange, sad story. Sarah asked me to let her know if Mia ever got the help she needed, and I promised I would. After Sarah left, I called Rachel to fill her in on this new development. She was as surprised as I'd been, but also relieved to have another piece of the puzzle. It makes her illness more understandable, Rachel said. She latched onto someone from her past, someone associated with a time when her housing was unstable, and turned them into the villain of her current story. It's tragic, but it's also kind of brilliant, in a fucked up way. 2 months later, Lisa called with an update. Mia had finally agreed to enter an inpatient mental health program. She was still struggling to accept reality, but she'd acknowledged that she needed help. She asked about you, Lisa told me. Wanted to know if you hated her for lying to you all those months. I asked Lisa to tell Mia that I didn't hate her, that I was proud of her for getting help, and that her job would be waiting when she was ready. It felt inadequate, but it was the truth. The inpatient program was a 30-day intensive therapy retreat in the mountains about 2 hours outside the city. Lisa drove Mia there on a gray Tuesday morning in late November. According to Lisa, Mia had packed a single duffel bag with everything she owned, which wasn't much after months of living in her car. She cried the whole drive, Lisa told me during one of our check-ins. Not sad crying, but relieved crying, like she was finally letting go of this enormous weight she'd been carrying. The program focused on people dealing with housing instability and the mental health challenges that often came with it. Mia would have individual therapy 3 times a week, group sessions daily, and structured activities designed to help her rebuild basic life skills and confidence. During her second week in the program, Mia called me. It was the first time I'd heard her voice since before the truth came out, and she sounded different, quieter but more present somehow. I wanted to apologize, she said without preamble. Not just for lying to you, but for making you part of my delusion. You were trying to be a good friend, and I took advantage of that. I told her I wasn't angry, that I was just glad she was getting help. We talked for about 20 minutes, and for the first time in our entire friendship, the conversation felt completely real. No elaborate stories, no dramatic crises, just 2 people talking honestly about a difficult situation. The therapist here says I created Sarah, the version of Sarah I was complaining about, because it was easier to believe I was being victimized than to accept that I was failing, Mia said. Having an enemy felt better than having no one to blame but myself. She told me about the group sessions, where she'd met other people who'd gone to similar lengths to hide their housing instability. A guy who'd pretended to have a job for 6 months while actually living in a 24-hour gym. A woman who'd created an entire fake family to explain why she could never invite people over to her non-existent apartment. It's not uncommon, Mia said. The shame is so intense that people will do almost anything to avoid admitting they're homeless. The therapist calls it protective mythology. We create stories that preserve our sense of dignity, even when those stories become prisons. After Mia completed the program, she moved back in with Lisa temporarily, while looking for transitional housing. She'd been diagnosed with depression and anxiety, along with what her therapist called adjustment disorder with mixed emotional features. Basically, when faced with overwhelming stressors, her mind created alternate realities that felt more manageable than the truth. Lisa helped her apply for subsidized housing and disability benefits while Mia continued with outpatient therapy twice a week. The process was slow and frustrating, full of bureaucratic delays and waiting lists, but Mia seemed committed to doing the work. Rachel had been true to her word about holding Mia's job open, but when Mia was finally ready to return to work, she asked if she could start somewhere else. I don't think I can come back to the coffee shop, she told me during one of our phone calls. Too many memories of the person I was pretending to be. I need to start fresh somewhere where I can just be myself. I understood, even though I was disappointed. I'd been looking forward to having the real Mia as a coworker, to building a friendship based on honesty instead of fiction. But she needed to make choices that supported her recovery, even if those choices meant leaving familiar people behind. Rachel helped Mia get a job at a bookstore across town, putting in a good word with the manager and providing a reference that focused on Mia's reliability and customer service skills, without mentioning the circumstances of her departure from our cafe. Meanwhile, I found myself changed by the whole experience. I was more attentive to the people around me, more willing to ask direct questions when something seemed off. I'd learned that sometimes being a good friend means pushing back against comfortable lies, even when it's easier to just listen and sympathize. Jake noticed the change in me first. You've been different since the Mia thing, he said one afternoon while we were cleaning the espresso machine. I don't know, more present, I guess. He was right. I'd been coasting through my early 20s, treating work as just a job and treating my relationships as casual entertainment. distant. But seeing how isolated and desperate Mia had become made me realize how important genuine connection really was. I started reaching out more to friends who seemed to be struggling. My buddy Marcus, who'd been making jokes about his bachelor lifestyle while living in a studio apartment he clearly couldn't afford. My cousin David, who'd been posting weird, angry rants on social media after his girlfriend broke up with him. Instead of just scrolling past or making sympathetic noises, I started making actual phone calls, suggesting we hang out in person, asking more specific questions about how they were really doing. Most of the time, people were fine. Marcus was actually happy with his simple living situation, and David just needed to vent for a while before moving on from his breakup. But a few times I found friends who were genuinely struggling and just needed someone to notice. My relationship with Emma deepened too. The Mia situation had shown me how easy it was for people to drift away from reality when they felt too ashamed to share their problems. Emma and I started having more honest conversations about our fears, our financial struggles, our family issues. It wasn't always comfortable, but it felt more real than the surface-level dating we'd been doing before. "I'm proud of you," Emma told me one night as we walked through the park near her apartment, "for caring about Mia even after you found out she'd been lying. A lot of people would have just written her off as crazy." "She wasn't crazy," I said, though I'd had to work through my own feelings about that. "She was in pain and didn't know how to ask for help." "That's different." 6 months after Mia left the coffee shop, she called to tell me she'd found her own apartment. It was a tiny studio in a transitional housing complex, but it was hers. She had her own key, her own address, her own space that no one could take away from her. "I have a couch," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "A real couch that faces whatever direction I want it to face." She was working part-time at the bookstore, and part-time as a peer counselor for people experiencing housing instability. The peer counseling job had come through the program she'd completed, and she was surprisingly good at it. Turns out, all that experience creating elaborate stories is actually useful, she told me with a laugh that sounded different from her old laughs. More grounded somehow. "I can help people identify when they're creating protective myths instead of dealing with their real problems." We started meeting for coffee occasionally, not at my work, but at a neutral cafe downtown. The conversations were different from our old ones. Mia would tell me about her therapy sessions, her struggles with medication side effects, the frustrating process of rebuilding her credit and her life, but she'd also tell me about small victories, books she'd read and loved, friendships she was building with other people in recovery, a pottery class she'd started taking at the community center. "I'm not the same person I was when we worked together," she said during one of these coffee dates, "but I'm not sure I want to be." That person was so afraid of being seen as imperfect that she created an entire fake life. "This version of me is messier, but she's real." I told her about the changes in my own life, how her situation had made me think more deeply about friendship and honesty, how I'd started reaching out more to people who seemed isolated, how Emma and I had decided to move in together, partly because we'd learned the importance of having someone you could be completely honest with. "That's the thing about rock bottom," Mia said, stirring honey into her tea. "It's terrifying when you're falling toward it, but once you hit it, you realize you can survive the impact, and then you have a solid foundation to build from." A year after the revelation about Mia's living situation, I ran into Sarah again at the grocery store. She was back in town visiting friends and looked healthier than when I'd first met her. The stress lines around her eyes had faded, and she had the confident posture of someone who'd found their place in the world. "How's Mia doing?" she asked immediately. "I think about her sometimes and wonder if she's okay." I filled her in on Mia's progress, and Sarah's relief was obvious. "I felt so guilty for so long," she admitted. "Like maybe if I'd tried harder to help when we lived together, or if I hadn't moved away, things would have been different." "We all felt that way," I told her. "But Mia's therapist says that's not how mental health works. People have to be ready to accept help, and sometimes that takes hitting rock bottom first." Sarah nodded, seeming to accept this, but then she surprised me with her next question. "Do you think she'd want to hear from me? Not to rehash the past, but just to, I don't know, make peace with it all." I promised to ask Mia and get back to her. When I brought it up during our next coffee date, Mia was quiet for a long time. "I owe her an apology," she finally said. "A real one, not the kind where I try to justify what I did." She was dealing with her own life, and I turned her into the villain of mine. That wasn't fair. 2 weeks later, Mia and Sarah met at the same downtown cafe where Mia and I had been having our regular conversations. I wasn't there, but Mia called me afterward to tell me how it went. "It was hard," she said, "but good hard, you know." Sarah was so gracious about everything. She told me she'd been worried about me all this time, that she never held any anger about the texts or the accusations. We both cried a lot. The conversation had lasted almost 3 hours. They'd talked about their time as roommates, the pressures they'd both been under, the different ways they'd each struggled with the transition to adult independence. Sarah had shared some of her own challenges with anxiety and financial instability, and Mia had been able to offer perspective from her recovery work. "We're not going to be best friends or anything," Mia said. "Too much history for that, but we have closure now. She understands what I was going through, and I understand how my actions affected her. That feels important." Around the same time, Mia started dating someone she'd met in her pottery class. His name was Tom, and he was a few years older, a social worker who'd gone back to school after spending his 20s in various jobs that didn't fit. He knew about Mia's mental health history and her period of homelessness, and it didn't scare him off. "He's not trying to save me or fix me," Mia told me when she first mentioned him. "He's just present. He listens when I need to talk, gives me space when I need to be alone, and doesn't make me feel like I have to be anyone other than who I am right now." Their relationship developed slowly, with Mia being careful to maintain her independence and continue prioritizing her mental health, but she seemed genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen during our coffee shop days. "I think the difference is that I'm not performing anymore," she explained during one of our coffee dates. "With Tom, with my job, with my friends, with you, I don't have to create stories to make my life seem more interesting or more manageable than it is. I can just exist as myself, problems and all." 2 years after the revelation, Rachel offered me a promotion to assistant manager at the coffee shop. I'd been thinking about what I wanted to do long term, and while I enjoyed the work, I'd become more interested in social services after watching Mia's recovery journey. I ended up enrolling in night classes to get certified as a peer support specialist, similar to the work Mia was doing. The training was intense, covering everything from mental health first aid to housing advocacy therapy to crisis intervention, but it felt like meaningful work in a way that making lattes never had. Emma was supportive of the career change, even though it meant I'd be making less money initially. We'd moved in together successfully, partly because we'd learned from Mia's experience the importance of honest communication about finances, mental health, and household responsibilities. I've watched you light up every time you talk about helping people navigate crisis situations, Emma said when I was wavering about whether to take the certification program seriously. You're good at it, and it makes you happy. That matters more than a bigger paycheck. My first client as a peer support specialist was a guy named Roberto, who'd been living in his truck for 4 months after losing his apartment following a layoff. He reminded me of Mia in some ways. Proud, intelligent, and so ashamed of his situation that he'd been turning down help even when it was offered. I keep thinking this is temporary, he told me during our first meeting. Like if I just wait a little longer, find the right job, save enough money, I can get back to normal without anyone having to know what happened. I shared some of Mia's story with him, with her permission. How the shame of being homeless had trapped her in an elaborate fiction that ultimately made her situation worse. How accepting help had been the first step toward building a stable life. The thing is, I told Roberto, there's no shame in needing help. The shame comes from suffering in silence when support is available. Roberto was easier to work with than Mia had been initially. He didn't have the same level of mental health complications, just the practical challenge of getting back on his feet after a series of unfortunate circumstances. Within 3 months, we'd helped him find transitional housing, and within 6 months, he'd landed a job that paid enough for him to afford his own apartment. But every client reminded me of something I'd learned from Mia's situation. People will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve their dignity, even when those efforts make their problems worse. My job was to help them find ways to maintain their self-respect while still accepting the support they needed to rebuild their lives. Mia and I still met for coffee regularly, though less frequently as we both got busier with work and relationships. She'd been promoted to full-time at the bookstore and was considering going back to school to get a degree in social work. I want to do more than just peer counseling, she told me during one of our recent conversations. I want to understand the systems better, maybe work on policy changes that could prevent other people from falling through the cracks the way I did. She'd also started speaking at conferences and training sessions, sharing her story with social workers, mental health professionals, and housing advocates. It was difficult emotionally, but she felt like it was important work. Every time I tell the story, it gets a little easier, she said. And every time, at least one person comes up to me afterward and says they recognize themselves or someone they love in what I've shared. That makes it worth it. Tom had proposed to Mia 6 months earlier, and they were planning a small wedding for the following spring. She'd asked me to be one of her witnesses, which felt like a huge honor given everything we'd been through. You were one of the few people who saw me at my worst and didn't give up on me, she said when she asked. Even when you didn't understand what was happening, you kept showing up. That meant everything. The wedding was small and simple, held in the community center where Mia still took pottery classes. Lisa was there along with Tom's family, a few friends from work, and some people from Mia's recovery community. Sarah even came, traveling from Portland to be part of the celebration. During her short speech at the reception, Mia talked about the difference between the stories we tell ourselves and the truth we have to live with. For a long time, I thought my value as a person depended on having a perfect life story, she said, Tom's hand in hers. But I've learned that our worth comes from how we handle the messy, imperfect reality of being human. Tom loves me not despite my struggles, but including them. That's the kind of love everyone deserves. I thought about that speech a lot in the months that followed. How many of us create elaborate fictions to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about our lives? How many people are suffering in silence because they're too ashamed to admit they need help? My work as a peer support specialist had shown me that Mia's story wasn't unusual. I'd worked with people who'd pretended to have jobs for months while secretly applying for unemployment benefits. People who'd maxed out credit cards to maintain the appearance of financial stability. People who'd isolated themselves from friends and family rather than admit they were struggling with depression or addiction. The common thread was shame. The belief that needing help meant being weak, that struggling meant being a failure, that asking for support would somehow diminish their worth as human beings. But I'd also seen what happened when people found the courage to tell the truth about their situations. Like Roberto, who'd not only gotten back on his feet but had started volunteering to help other people experiencing homelessness. Like Maria, a single mother who'd been living in her car with her 2 kids until she finally reached out to social services and found transitional housing that led to a stable apartment and a better job. The transformation wasn't always dramatic or immediate. Recovery from any kind of crisis is usually slow, with setbacks and complications along the way. But there was something powerful about watching people reclaim their authentic lives after years of living in fiction. 3 years after the revelation about Mia's living situation, I was promoted to program coordinator for the peer support program where I worked. Part of my job involved training new peer specialists, and I always included Mia's story in the curriculum with her permission. The important thing to understand, I'd tell the trainees, is that elaborate deceptions like this don't happen because people are dishonest by nature. They happen because the shame of struggling is so intense that fiction feels safer than reality. Our job is to create spaces where people can tell the truth about their lives without losing their dignity. Some trainees would push back, arguing that lying to friends and coworkers for months was manipulative and unfair. They weren't wrong, but they were missing the bigger picture. Of course, it's not fair to the people who care about you, I'd acknowledge, but people in crisis don't always make rational decisions. They make survival decisions. Mia's elaborate fiction was a way of surviving emotionally when she couldn't figure out how to survive practically. The training program had grown significantly since I'd started. We were now placing peer specialists in hospitals, housing agencies, mental health clinics, and even some coffee shops and restaurants where staff were trained to recognize signs of housing instability and connect people with resources. Rachel had actually volunteered to have our program train her staff at the coffee shop. If we'd known what to look for, she said, maybe we could have helped Mia before things got so bad. Emma and I had gotten engaged ourselves, inspired partly by watching Mia and Tom build a relationship based on radical honesty about their struggles and imperfections. We were planning our own small wedding for the fall, and Mia had offered to help with the planning since she'd learned so much organizing her own celebration. The thing about almost losing everything, Mia told me during one of our wedding planning sessions, is that it teaches teaches you what actually matters. Not having a perfect story, not impressing other people, not maintaining some image of success, just being real with the people you love and letting them be real with you. During our engagement party, I found myself thinking about all the ways my life had changed since that day I'd knocked on the door of Mia's empty apartment. I'd found work that felt meaningful, built relationships that were based on honesty rather than performance, and learned to recognize when people in my life might be struggling even when they seemed fine on the surface. But mostly, I'd learned that everyone is capable of creating elaborate fictions when reality becomes too painful to bear. The difference between getting lost in those fictions and finding your way back to truth often comes down to whether you have people in your life who are willing to see past the stories and love you anyway. As I looked around the party at friends and family who'd shown up to celebrate Emma and me, I felt grateful for all of it. The messy, imperfect, sometimes difficult reality of building authentic relationships with flawed human beings. It was so much better than any fiction I could have created. Mia caught my eye across the room and raised her glass in a small toast. She was talking to Sarah, who'd driven down for the party, and both of them were laughing about something. 5 years ago, I never would have imagined this scene. The woman who'd created an elaborate fictional roommate, celebrating with the real person she'd turned into a villain, at a party for the coworker who discovered her deception. But that's the thing about truth, I'd learned. It's messier than fiction, but it's also more surprising, more complex, and ultimately more beautiful than any story we could make up. And it has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities of people who are brave enough to stop performing and start being real with each other. The next morning, as Emma and I cleaned up from the party, I found myself thinking about how to tell this story. Not just Mia's story, but all our stories. The interconnected web of shame, deception, recovery, and redemption that had brought us all to this point. You should write it down, Emma said when I shared my thoughts with her. All of it. Not just what happened to Mia, but what it taught you about people, about friendship, about the stories we tell ourselves to survive. So that's what I did. I wrote it all down, starting with that day I knocked on an empty apartment door and ending with this moment, sitting in my own apartment with the woman I love, no longer afraid of what truths we might discover about each other, because that's the real lesson of Mia's story, I think. Not that people sometimes lie when they're desperate, but that healing happens when we find the courage to stop lying and start living in the truth of who we really are, struggles and all. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find people who are willing to love us not despite those struggles, but because of the strength it takes to survive them and the wisdom that comes from learning to be real in a world that often rewards fiction. The empty apartment had been full all along, full of pain, full of shame, full of elaborate stories designed to make unbearable reality seem manageable, but it was also full of a human being who was worth saving, worth knowing, worth loving exactly as she was. That's not what I expected when I walked into that empty apartment 3 years ago, but it's exactly what I needed to learn.